So I was having a conversation with a buddy the other day, and I was pointing to how in a sense useless thought is when it comes to experiencing life, happiness, joy, right? How sort of useless thought is in the living aspect of life. And he came back at me with the classic, well, why do we have these minds then? And minds are great when they're tools. They have a great practical kind of use. It's just that they're really lousy and get in the way of realizing what we are, and in living life in a really joyful kind of experiential way. We've trained ourselves in such a way that we use our minds for everything, and we look to our minds in ways that might not have even existed a few hundred years ago, or if you were to go to a more primitive, quote unquote, culture, right? Let's just let's step back in time a few hundred years, right? And the potter, let's say, at his wheel, doesn't really have a big use for mind. They know their craft, right? And if you've experienced craft like that, it's a very sensory, perception, experience-oriented thing to craft something. It's not a thought-oriented process. It's not about thinking about the next move. You do that while that wheel is spinning, and the clay is going to go flying off. It's all about feeling and these minute adjustments that are really too fast for the mind to handle. Even more sort of broad technical kind of trades, you go back a little ways in time, say like carpentry, for instance, right? And a lot of the tools and techniques in carpentry just 100 years ago were designed to be used in the most sort of thoughtless way. So, for instance, one of those things, right, that we're doing all the time in carpentry is measuring, which is, getting into thought, right? And what they knew back then, and a few people know still today, is when we introduce that thought, that calculation into woodworking, it's actually the greatest source of error. is almost always in calculation. And so to get around that, what woodworkers used to use was called a story pole. And a story pole is basically just a stick. And it had all the key measurements of whatever you were making referenced on that stick. And you would use that stick over and over and over again. Because most of the time we're just making the same, measuring the same thing again, marking the same thing again, measuring the same thing again. And so the story pole would just carry all of this measurements already made on it, and made precisely, ideally. And you would just use that same measuring stick over and over and over again. And there were different scales of that. There was, story poles that were used in building trades. There were story poles that were much smaller that were used in woodworking. And so I found myself contemplating this in a broader way, right? This question of, mind seems so important, right? And of course, mind seems very important to mind, because it's always doing stuff. It's always thinking about the next thing. How are we going to get there? How are we going to get there? How are we going to solve this? Oh, I need to think about the past. How can we resolve my past? And I think even the sort of question, what do we have these minds for, is a very mind-centric kind of question. So just take a little experiential journey with me for a moment. So on the time scale of the universe, right? All of the human race is the tiniest blip. Right? Like, humans have been around for, a grain of sand's worth of time on the celestial beach. And, if, let's say, just for instance, we make it for a few more 1,000 years, and it takes us a few thousand more years to realize how useless this, super mind-oriented kind of Western philosophy is. How not just useless, but not helpful to living in a satisfied way, in a joyful way. let's say 5,000 years it takes the human race to realize this. How infinitesimally small is that 5,000 years in the scale of the evolution of human beings? Right? Is that another grain of sand on a beach? So it's, one grain of sand for us to be around. And a grain of sand of that grain of sand for us to maybe realize that there's better ways to train ourselves, to use our minds, to use them as tools rather than be used by them. It's just a blip. We are such a tiny blip when we look at it that way, right? And when you're feeling into that vastness, that scale, how consequential does the mind really feel at that point? Not very consequential to me. Not very. So just a little exercise.